Now, my colleagues in QB Local 3903 at York, Christina, Rousseau, and Steve Silva.
So I'm trying to cut this out. So a lot of the issues that we face are very similar to what Silva and I have talked about. So hopefully there won't be too much overlap. So Steve and I are going to be talking about kind of the overall goal. Our overall goal is to talk about what are some of the ways that academic workers can contribute to the creation of counter-hegemonic structures. So I'm going to talk a bit about the particular of our local at York University, and Steve's going to talk about a more general approach. So for my examination of 3903, which is contract faculty, teaching assistants, and research assistants at York University, I want to focus on two important aspects of the local that's contributed to its ability to function the way it does. So first is the process of open bargaining, or what people call bargaining from below. And second is the creation of non-hierarchical structures and number-driven initiatives. So 3903 as a militant local has a long history dating back to the 1980s when we were a different local. But so the early 1990s saw actually a period of decline in militancy during the reign of the NDP and Ray Days, and there was accepting of wage freezes and things like that, which isn't entirely surprising because there's often a sense of complicity, I think, amongst other radical folks when so-called progressive elements are in power. However, by the time the Harris government came into power in 95 with the Common Sense Revolution, unions militancy was on its way back and was in full swing by late 90s in the rise of the anti-globalization movement. So 2000 and 2001 was an important turning point for our local in terms of bargaining power. So the late 1990s saw a period of one-year contracts negotiated in our local, meaning the local was in a constant state of mobilization. So going back for a moment to 1998, when the concept of open bargaining in our local was initially introduced through a motion brought forward by the Women's Caucus, calling for open bargaining as a means of ensuring inclusivity and transparency. So while this motion was adopted in theory, it was not put into practice until midway through the 2001 strike. Up to this point, members were barred from attending and participating in bargaining. And so as bargaining progressed, it was becoming clear that certain key proposals, including tuition indexation, was under threat. So at a general membership meeting well into the strike, one of the bargaining team members got up and told the members that basically, like, tie my hands, so to speak. So at this point, the members directed the bargaining team with specific language, which led to many, a lot of people were kind of conflicted about this because they thought it was bordering on illegal bargaining practices, etc. And however, during the strike, the local partially defeated forced ratification, Unit 2 settled, but Units 1 and 3 stayed on strike and held the line for 78 days. So they actually won tuition indexation language as a result, and as well as a bunch of other important gains. So this move towards member-driven bargaining was a crucial turning point, and it was in the 2005 round of bargaining when some of these practices were solidified. So the process of open bargaining was codified in the bargaining parameters, which are negotiated with and agreed with the employer. So this includes the now, what's become practice, I guess, in the last few rounds of bargaining, what we call a final offer GMM, general membership meeting, which decides whether or not the local will strike or settle. So the practices developed in 2001 and 2005 rounds of bargaining were used again in 2008 and 2011, showing that this is has been a useful tactic in terms of making significant gains in the context of collective agreement negotiations, whether through averting a strike or going on strike or being locked out, as was the case in 2008. Some of the practices of open bargaining that we use include members being allowed to attend bargaining and participate, though not vote, in the caucus meetings. Refusing to bargain with a media blackout, which was actually something that in 2001 during the strike led to, it was a two-day blackout that led to a lot of potential losses, but they were not behind it. Having members recommend whether the exec and bargaining team should accept a collective agreement in a way that adheres to labor law. Having direct membership involvement in the process, whether through the drafting of specific bargaining language and setting pillars and priorities. So for our local, the practice of open, transparent, and member-involved bargaining has been successful. On the other hand, it's something that our parent union, and I use the term parent deliberately because it's very paternalistic, they don't like it. And it was one of the reasons we were placed under trusteeship after the 2008 strike, where we actually broke our record for the longest strike and stayed out for 85 days before being legislated back to work. So the fact that we were legislated back to work, I think, kind of signals the strength that can come from this kind of mobilization. but also showing that increasingly employers are becoming reliant on the state to step in, and so they actually have no incentive to negotiate with us. So we actually need to rethink different ways to negotiate and to bargain or not bargain. So the second aspect I want to cover is kind of the more broad membership involvement in the day-to-day operations of the local. So while it's true that much of 393's militant nature is due to the presence of progressive lefty folks, because York tends to draw those kind of people, this doesn't paint a full picture because, it's one thing to study Marxist philosophy, but quite another thing to implement this theory into practices that allow for the creation of organizing structures that promote broad-based grassroots activism. So in other words, York and 393 are not radical breeding grounds because of the presence of folks in progressive departments, but because of those who've been able to create meaningful practice that pushes the local towards a social justice model of unionism. So this means seeing our power as a local not limited to negotiating the terms of our collective agreement. These are important for our day-to-day, our own immediate situations, but it's also been important for our local to have connections to groups outside of union structures through member-driven initiatives. So, for example, the First Nations Solidarity Working Group, which is currently the most active group in our local, the Flying Squad, who particularly in the late 90s and early 2000s were involved in community justice groups like OCAP, the Anti-Racism Working Group, and the International Solidarity Working Group, which played a major role in drafting of Resolution 50. Of solidarity with Palestinians. Yeah, BDS. Okay, sorry. So the presence of working groups in the local was also important in the way it changed the structure and operations of 393. After the 2001 strike, there was a major overhaul of the local's bylaws, which allowed for the creation of working groups as entities that were quite different from the committee structure. So they had a semi-autonomous relationship with the local. Other provisions of these new bylaws ensured the flattening of hierarchical structures. So for example, there was language that said that the chair could assert themselves as the chair of every committee in the local. After the 2008 strike, however, when we were put under trusteeship, there was another overhaul of our bylaws, which actually took away all of these progressive, non-hierarchical provisions. So, for example, one important piece that we lost was the language that allowed for the membership to recall members of the executive who were not adequately fulfilling their duties. So all this is to say that our local has a long and complicated history of grassroots engagement. And while we are different from other academic locals in some ways, we're very similar in the sense that we all are facing this increasing precarity.
So while Christina is speaking to, I think, the possibilities and prospects for us as a militant local to share some lessons with the broader labor movement, especially as both wing organizers within Rebuilding Militant Labor right now, an initiative that's trying to create more rank and file militant organizing across the labor movement. I wanted to speak a bit more generally to the possibilities of academic workers in playing a role in building counter-hegemonic structures, in reorganizing the revolutionary left, given the context that we're working within. The context has been sufficiently kind of charted out and outlined in general contours by a lot of the panelists here today. Everybody here has spoken to the precariousness, the increasing precariousness of academic workers as a labor force. So what this is doing is an increasing proportion of us, and I know this from, anecdotally, working with my colleagues and my comrades, that fewer and fewer among us actually are clinging on to the idea that we're actually doing a tenure track, that more and more of us are holding out within the university as a way to not be thrown into the rest of the labor force and not know what to do with the rest of our lives and escaping student debts. And so the illusions are quickly dissipating, or if not already long gone, that we have a stable or class ascendancy within the academic life. And this while employment continues to, enrollment within the universities continue to increase within an increasingly corporatized and entrepreneurial university structure that was discussed earlier this morning, with students coming in also with a degree of anxiety, increasing degree of anxiety about their futures, the job prospects dissipating or not being there, with record levels of student debts. And that's the context within our sector, within the broader context of these generalized attacks that are occurring across the entire labor force. Not to mention other general crises unfolding in the world, increasing imperialist aggressions and wars. Not to mention, as the UN reports this past week, finally reading the writing on the wall, or the 12,000 peer-reviewed journal articles suggesting that the major collapse of the biosphere and life systems within it over the next century, and preceded by NASA's report a week earlier that civilization as we know it will collapse in the next 2 generations. So the context is somewhat bleak. So, borrowing a phrase that somebody else here earlier speaking in the panel in this room, I believe it was Rebecca Shine, talking about coerced bad faith, being in a position as academics, playing a role in propagating these illusions for our students. She was speaking particularly to playing this administrative role in facilitating internships, that it's time for us to break with this bad faith and maybe embrace the crisis that we're facing, and help our students cultivate their fears of the future so we can actually come to terms with the battles that are on the horizon, if not immediately in front of us. So what I wanted to talk about in particular is the prospects and possibilities of building combat positions within the university, which I think it's instructive to return to Althusser, the notion of the ideological state apparatus, viewing the university as one among many ideological state apparatuses. And, Althusser's analysis of state apparatuses in general, viewed ideological apparatuses as a fluid terrain wherein class struggle could actually play out, as opposed to repressive apparatuses. You're not going to go into the RCMP and be like, hey, maybe we shouldn't crack some skulls and have this raid on this native community with this impending, C10 legislation that'll ban native tobacco and so on and so forth. Within ideological state apparatuses, though, given the necessity to constantly renew, maintain, and reinvent ideological hegemony with transforming conditions within our society, there's a lot of room for us to, entrench ourselves in a way that we can actually see class struggle come into the ideological state apparatuses. And so, also to riff on Gramsci a bit, there's a possibility to create these combat positions, to create these trenches within ideological state apparatuses where we can contribute to the larger dynamic of class struggles playing out within society. Now, I should offer the qualification that I don't think that we as academic workers will constitute some kind of vanguard force within the larger social and popular struggles playing out within society in general or throughout the world. I think we should neither overestimate nor underestimate the possibilities for academic workers who don't see themselves in the future in academia or don't see themselves in the society in general. So particularly I wanted to speak to a number of ways, again to borrow on Gramsci, that we could contribute to a general war of position, at least at the level of ideas and in relation to struggles playing out outside the university. And this is not to use the liberal appropriations of Gramsci where, propagating ideas, the subjective factor is divorced from the political struggles. And if you read Gramsci directly, he stressed the necessity to, given the failures of the insurrectionary communist movements in the 20s, the necessity to develop the subjective factor, the necessity for ideological struggle as part of a revolutionary transformation of society. But he said that alongside recognizing your need to build up your political and military capacity as a people to fight imperialism and capitalism. That those things were not, it wasn't just like, let's all shift to ideas here. And so I think the role that we can play as academic workers are, I see at least 5. One, as teachers, right? Who are coming across and interacting with some of us, those who have as many as 12 contracts in a year sometimes, are interacting with hundreds of students throughout a year. And there's those of us who use the academia and our role as undergraduate or graduate students as a holding ground while we're activists. We're not really committed to academia, we're just doing activism on the outside and pretending to be academics along the way, which I would consider myself sort of in that kind of way. Then there's a type of academia which I think is in genuine service to popular struggles. The type of academics that go and entrench themselves in popular struggles and produce literature that is not for the ivory tower, that's actually to critically reflect back experiences of popular struggle that people can use in their actual, in their struggles. 4, I think there's also a role for just a revolutionary left intelligentsia in general. That is just beyond popular struggles, that plays a role in building that ideological counter-hegemony. And then there's the role that Christina spoke to, which is as academic workers, the role that we can play within the union movement, where the likes of our parent union and their leadership have a real ideological domination with a set of views about Keynesian framework that is long beyond exhaustive. And however, just to conclude, while there are multiple ways as academic workers that we can actually play a role in developing a revolutionary counter-hegemony, it can only be by relating to popular struggles that are playing out in broader society. And I would stress the point that, in opposition to the way there's been a lot of liberal appropriations of Gramsci in academia, in the literature, that Gramsci was speaking to the necessity to build a unified, strategically oriented movement in which those who are playing a role in the intelligentsia and the propagation of ideas are subservient to this general strategic direction of revolutionary social change. That's something that's clearly lacking. Right? We don't have a revolutionary left in this country, but as we proceed and spiral downward into social and economic and ecological crisis, there's an increasing necessity for us to develop a clear, programmatic, revolutionary orientation that can be popularized. And I think the 5 kind of areas in which we can, play a positive role as academic workers could be important for building that counter-hegemony, but there's much work to be done for that. Hopefully some of this will come out in discussion.